May 14, 1945.
Berlin.
The Tiergarten. The smell of Berlin in the spring of 1945 was not the smell of flowers. It was the smell of wet limestone, pulverized brick, and the sweet, cloying rot of the thousands still buried under the rubble. General George S. Patton Jr. stood in his open-top jeep, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the pale sun. He looked like a statue cast in bronze, but inside he was a volcano. He looked out at the city he had been forbidden from taking. He had wanted to race to Berlin to plant the stars and stripes on the Reichstag, but the politicians in Washington and the chairman in London had handed the prize to the Soviets. To Patton, it wasn't just a strategic mistake. It was a sin. "Look at them, Hap," Patton spat, gesturing with a gloved hand toward a group of Soviet soldiers lounging near a wrecked Tiger tank. They were dirty, drinking out of looted bottles, their uniforms a mismatched collection of Red Army wool and stolen German boots. They look like Mongolian bandits. "We spent 4 years killing the wrong bastards." His aide, Colonel Hobart Hap Gay, remained silent. He knew better than to argue when the general was in a Scythian mood. Patton called the Russians Scythians, a nomadic, warlike people of antiquity, because he believed they were fundamentally uncivilized. "Ike wants us to play nice," Gay finally ventured. "There's a banquet tonight. The Soviets are hosting. Marshal Zhukov will be there." Patton's jaw tightened. "Zhukov, the butcher. He doesn't lead men, he spends them. I've seen their casualty lists, Hap. They don't have a medical corps. They have a burial detail. And tonight I have to sit there, drink their kerosene-flavored vodka, and pretend I don't want to drive my Third Army all the way to Moscow, the headquarters of the Supreme Commander."
Frankfurt.
General Dwight D. Eisenhower was sitting behind a desk piled high with paperwork that had nothing to do with tanks and everything to do with calories. He was responsible for feeding a continent. He was also responsible for preventing a Third World War. His chief of staff, Bedell Smith, walked in holding a decoded cable from the State Department. "Ike, we have a problem. It's George." Eisenhower didn't even look up. "Which George? Marshal or Patton? If it's Marshal, I'm listening. If it's Patton, give me a cigarette first." "It's Patton," Smith said, lighting a smoke for his boss. "He's been talking to the press again. Off the record, but you know George. He told a reporter from the Chicago Tribune that the Red Army is nothing but shifty-eyed peasants and that we should keep the German panzers armed and use them to push Ivan back to the steppes." Eisenhower leaned back, the smoke curling around his tired face. "He's going to get me killed, Bedell. Or worse, he's going to get 10 million people killed. Stalin is already paranoid. He thinks we're cutting a secret deal with the remains of the Wehrmacht." "There's more," Smith added. "The Soviets are holding a grand victory banquet in Berlin tonight. Zhukov has specifically invited Patton. They want to honor the man who raced across France. But we know what they really want. They want to see if the rumors are true. They want to see if the American lion is truly as toothless as the diplomats say." Eisenhower stood up and walked to the window. "Send a message to George. Tell him if he so much as frowns at a Soviet officer, I'll strip him of his command and send him back to California to command a cadet barracks. Tell him to smile. Tell him to toast to eternal friendship." "You think he'll listen?" "George listens to the ghosts of Caesar and Napoleon," Ike sighed. "He doesn't listen to me. But God help us if he speaks his mind tonight." The banquet hall.
Berlin-Karlshorst.
The building was one of the few left standing in the district. The Soviets had draped it in massive red banners that seemed to bleed down the walls. Inside, the long tables groaned under the weight of caviar, roasted meats, and endless, shimmering bottles of Stolichnaya. The room was a sea of medals. Soviet marshals with chests covered in gold stars stood side by side with American and British generals. But the atmosphere was not one of celebration. It was a room full of predators who had just finished eating the same prey and were now wondering if they were still hungry. Patton entered the room. He was dressed in his warlord uniform, polished helmet, gleaming boots, and the medals he had earned in the blood of North Africa, Sicily, and the Bulge. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who had conquered Berlin, walked toward him. Zhukov was short, square-shouldered, and had a face like a slab of granite. He didn't smile, he merely observed. Through a translator, Zhukov spoke. "The great General Patton, we have watched your maps. You move fast, almost as fast as the Red Army." Patton's eyes narrowed. He could feel the vodka being poured into his glass. He remembered the reports from the morning. Soviet soldiers harassing American supply lines, the accidental strafing of U.S. columns by Yak fighters. "I move fast because my men are professionals, Marshal," Patton replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They don't need a commissar behind them with a machine gun to keep them moving forward." The translator hesitated. The room went quiet. The Soviet officers nearby stopped laughing. Zhukov's expression didn't change, but his eyes turned into chips of ice. "In Russia, we have a saying, the dog barks, but the caravan moves on." "In America," Patton countered, stepping closer until he was inches from the marshal's face, "we have a saying too, don't start a fight you can't finish." Hapgay grabbed Patton's elbow. "General, the toast is starting." Patton allowed himself to be led away, but he didn't take his eyes off Zhukov. He felt a profound sense of disgust. He saw the Soviet officers laughing and drinking, and all he could see were the millions of people in Eastern Europe who were being traded from one tyrant to another. He looked at the bottle of vodka on the table. He reached for it, but not to drink. He looked at the label, then at the Soviet marshal sitting at the head of the table. The insult was coming. It wasn't a slow build. It was a flash of lightning. Eisenhower had told him to be a diplomat. Churchill had told him to be a friend. But Patton was a soldier, and he was tired of lying. He turned to the high-ranking Soviet officer sitting next to him, a general who had been boasting about how the Red Army would liberate Paris if they felt like it. Patton leaned in, his voice loud enough for the entire end of the table to hear. "General," Patton said, his smile as sharp as a bayonet, "I've been thinking about your liberation of Berlin." The Soviet general beamed. "Yes? It was a masterpiece of Soviet steel." "No," Patton said, his voice dropping to a deadly, audible whisper. "It was a funeral for Western civilization. And I'll tell you exactly what I think of your steel." The words that followed were so toxic, so unfiltered, and so dangerous that the American translator froze. He didn't translate them. He couldn't. But the Soviet general understood the tone. And he understood the one word Patton made sure to say in a way that required no translation. Part 1 ends as the room descends into a terrifying, suffocating silence. The silence in the hall didn't just fall. It crushed. The Soviet general, a man named Borisov, sat with his fork halfway to his mouth. He didn't speak English, but he was a veteran of Stalingrad. He knew the language of men who wanted to kill him. He looked at the American translator, a young captain named Miller, whose face had turned the color of a fresh sheet. "Translate," Borisov barked in Russian. Captain Miller looked at Patton, his eyes pleading. "General, sir. I can't say that." Patton didn't blink. He didn't look at the captain. He kept his eyes locked on Borisov. He leaned forward, the smell of expensive tobacco and cheap vodka mixing in the space between them. "I said," Patton repeated, his voice clear and cutting through the room like a whistle, "that I have no desire to drink with a Scythian son of a bitch who thinks he's a soldier just because he has a million peasants to throw into a minefield." This time, Patton didn't wait for the translator. He knew the word Scythian might be lost on them, but the Russian equivalent for son of a bitch, sukinsin, was universal. He said it with a hard American R roll that made it sound like a gunshot. The Soviet general stood up so fast his chair flipped over, clattering against the parquet floor. Across the room, Marshal Zhukov stopped mid-sentence. The laughter died. 100 Soviet officers reached, almost instinctively, for the holsters at their hips. On the American side, the reaction was pure, cold panic. Hapgay moved to stand behind Patton, his hand hovering near his own belt. "General," he whispered, "we have to go. Now." But Patton wasn't finished. He picked up his glass of vodka. He didn't raise it for a toast. He looked at Borisov, then at Zhukov at the head of the table. "You think you won this war?" Patton asked, his voice rising. You won it on American trucks, eating American spam, wearing American boots. Without us, you'd be speaking German in a labor camp in Siberia. And now you sit here and act like the masters of Europe? You aren't masters. You're just the next problem we have to solve. He downed the vodka, slammed the glass onto the table so hard the stem snapped, and turned his back on the entire Soviet high command. Let's go, Hap, Patton said. The air in here is starting to smell like a morgue. The drive back.
2 Uhr am.
The jeep sped through the ruins of Berlin. The headlights flickered over the hollowed-out shells of apartment buildings. You've done it now, sir, Hapke said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. That general, he's probably on the phone with Moscow right now. Stalin will have this on his desk by breakfast. Patton lit a cigar, the flare of the match illuminating a face that looked entirely at peace. Good, Patton said. Let the little cobbler in the Kremlin know that not everyone in the West is a coward. Ike is a politician. Bradley is a schoolteacher. Montgomery is a peacock. Someone has to tell the Russians that the party is over. Ike is going to have your head, Gay warned. Ike can have my head as long as he gives me my tanks, Patton retorted. We should have kept going, Hap. We should have taken Berlin, then Prague, then kept the engines running until we hit the Black Sea. Now we're going to spend the next 50 years watching these bastards turn half the world into a prison.
Frankfurt.
The IG Farben building, SHAEF HQ. The sun was barely up when the phone rang in Eisenhower's bedroom. He reached for it, thinking it was his wife, Mamie. It wasn't. It was Bedell Smith. Ike. This happened. The big one. Eisenhower sat up, rubbing his eyes. What did he do? He called a Soviet general a Scythian son of a bitch in front of 50 witnesses. He told them they were only alive because of American charity. And then he told them he was ready to solve the Russian problem next. Eisenhower was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then he let out a long, shuddering breath. Is there an official transcript? The Soviet liaison has already filed a formal protest with the State Department, Smith said. They're calling it an act of unprovoked aggression and fascist sentiment. They're demanding George be court-martialed. And the American press? Miller, the translator, told the SHAEF press pool. They're sitting on it for now, but it'll leak. By tomorrow, every paper from New York to London will have Patton's Sons of Bitches comment on the front page. Eisenhower stood up and walked to his desk. He looked at a map of the occupation zones. The world was a tinderbox. One spark, one arrogant ivory-handled spark, and the whole thing would go up. Get me the censors, Eisenhower ordered, and get me the logs from the banquet. I want every word Patton said scrubbed. If the official record says he toasted to the health of the Soviet Union, then that's what happened. Ike, you can't erase 50 witnesses, Smith argued. I can erase the history books, Eisenhower shouted. I can't afford a war with Russia because George Patton has a big mouth. Call the censors. Tell them that, for the sake of the alliance, those words were never spoken. And get Patton here. Now, I don't care if he has to fly through a thunderstorm. I want him in my office by noon. The meeting, 12:15 p.m. The doors to Eisenhower's office swung open. Patton marched in, his boots clicking on the floor. He didn't look like a man in trouble. He looked like a man expecting a promotion. Eisenhower didn't stand up. He didn't offer a chair. He didn't offer a cigarette. George, Ike said, his voice dangerously quiet. Did you say it? Patton stood at attention. I said several things, Ike. Most of them were true. I didn't ask if they were true. Eisenhower roared, slamming his hand on the desk. I asked if you called our allies Scythian sons of bitches. Patton's eyes flashed. They aren't allies, Ike. They're enemies who happen to be wearing the same color uniform for a few weeks. They're raping every woman in Berlin. They're dismantling every factory and shipping it to Moscow. They're building a wall around Eastern Europe, and you're standing here worried about my vocabulary. I am worried about the Third World War, George. We're already in it. Patton stepped closer to the desk, leaning over. You think they're going to stop at the Elbe? You think they're going to go home and become farmers? They want it all, Ike. And right now, we're the only thing that can stop them. My Third Army could be in Moscow in 2 months. Give me the word." Eisenhower looked at his old friend. He saw the genius, but he also saw the madness. He saw the man who had saved him in the Bulge, but he also saw the man who was now a liability to the human race. "There will be no word, George," Eisenhower said, his voice cold and final. "I have ordered the censors to strike your comments from the official records. As far as the United States government is concerned, you were a model of diplomacy last night." Patton let out a bitter laugh. "You're going to lie for them? You're going to protect them from me?" "I'm protecting the world from you," Eisenhower replied. "But don't think you've gotten away with it. You're done in Berlin. I'm moving you to the paper palace. You're going to supervise the writing of the official history of the war in Bavaria. No thanks. No press. No rations. Just you and a typewriter." Patton's face went pale. It was a death sentence for a warrior. "You're putting me in a cage, Ike? It's better than a casket, George, because that's where you're heading." As Patton turned to leave, Eisenhower added one more thing. "And George, the censors will keep the secret for now. But history has a way of finding the truth. Just pray that when it does, the world is strong enough to handle it." September 1945. Bad Nauheim, Germany. The paper palace. That's what the soldiers called the headquarters of the U.S. 15th Army in Bavaria. It was a place of archives, typewriters, and maps of battles already won. For George S. Patton, it was a mausoleum. He sat at a desk that smelled of lemon polish and old paper, staring out the window at the rolling German hills. His Third Army, his brave bastards, had been taken from him. He was no longer a conqueror, he was a librarian. "They think they've buried me, Hap," Patton said, not looking away from the window. Colonel Hobart Gay stood by the door, holding a stack of reports. "Ike is just trying to keep the peace, General. Washington is terrified of another war." Patton turned, his eyes burning with the old, familiar fire. "The war is already here. Every day the Soviets move the border markers a few inches west. Every day another Polish patriot disappears. We have the only force on earth that can stop them. And we're sitting here writing official histories while the Iron Curtain drops." He picked up a newspaper. The headlines were full of the new United Nations and the promise of a peaceful world. Patton threw it into the wastebasket. "Ike censored me in Berlin because he thought my words would start a war," Patton growled. "But it's the silence that will kill us. By the time they realize I was right about those Scythians, the Russians will have the atomic bomb and half of Europe in chains." The final slip. Eisenhower's censorship had worked, mostly. The Scythian son of a bitch comment had been scrubbed from the official banquet logs. The translator, Captain Miller, had been reassigned to a desk job in the Philippines. The Soviet protest had been met with a formal, empty apology from the State Department, claiming a misunderstanding of regional American dialects. But Patton couldn't stay quiet. It wasn't in his DNA. In a final press conference in late 1945, Patton blew the lid off again. When asked about denazification, he compared the Nazi Party to Republicans and Democrats back home. It was a clumsy, frustrated attempt to say that most Germans had joined the party just to keep their jobs. But to the world, it sounded like he was defending Hitler's henchmen. In Frankfurt, Eisenhower put his head in his hands. "I tried to save him," Ike whispered to Bedell Smith. "I buried the Russian insult. I buried the reports of him wanting to arm the panzers. But I can't bury this. George is determined to destroy himself." Eisenhower stripped Patton of his command of the 15th Army. The exile was complete. December 9, 1945. A road near Mannheim. The day was gray and biting cold. Patton was going pheasant hunting. It was supposed to be a quiet day away from the politics and the typewriters. As his 1938 Cadillac limousine drove through the industrial outskirts of Mannheim, a 2.5-ton truck suddenly swerved in front of them. It was a low-speed collision, the kind that shouldn't have killed anyone. But Patton was sitting tall in the back seat. When the cars hit, he was thrown forward. His head struck the metal frame of the glass partition between the front and back seats. The man who had survived the mud of the Musargon, the snipers of Sicily, and the shelling of the Bulge was paralyzed by a fender bender. The hospital.
Heidelberg.
12 days later, Patton lay in a hospital bed. He was a shell of the giant who had roared at Soviet marshals. He was trapped in a body that wouldn't move, listening to the quiet beep of the machines. Eisenhower came to visit, but he didn't go in. He stood in the hallway, looking through the small window in the door. He felt a profound sense of guilt. He had censored Patton's warnings to keep the world safe, but in doing so, he had broken the spirit of the only man who truly understood the cost of that safety. He was right, wasn't he, Ike? Bedell Smith asked, standing beside him. Eisenhower watched his old friend breathe. Ragged, shallow breaths. About the Russians? Yes, Eisenhower said softly. They're already violating the Yalta agreements. They're turning the Eastern Zone into a fortress. George saw it coming before any of us. Then why did we bury his words? Because if we had listened to him in May, Eisenhower replied, we would be fighting a war from the Rhine to the Pacific right now. George wanted to save the world with a sword. I have to try to save it with a pen. I don't know which of us is the bigger fool. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton Jr. died in his sleep. The Coda. 1953. Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in the Oval Office. He was now the President of the United States. The Cold War was in full swing. American boys were dying in Korea, fighting Soviet-backed forces. The world was exactly as Patton had predicted. Divided, paranoid, and on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Eisenhower opened a secure file from the National Archives. It contained the censored papers of 1945. There it was, the transcript of the Berlin banquet. The words Patton had spat at General Borisov. I have no desire to drink with a Scythian son of a bitch who thinks he's a soldier just because he has 1,000,000 peasants to throw into a minefield. Eisenhower picked up a pen. He could release the papers now. He could show the world that Patton had been a prophet. He could use it to fire up the American public for the long struggle against communism. He hovered over the declassify stamp. Then, he thought of the millions of families who just wanted a few more years of peace before the next storm. He thought of the fragility of the world he had spent his life trying to hold together. He closed the file and put it back in the classified drawer. Not yet, Eisenhower whispered to the empty office. The world still isn't strong enough for your truth, George. The brutal insult remained a secret for decades, buried under the weight of a peace that was as cold and hard as the Berlin winter. Patton had been silenced, but as the tanks lined up at Checkpoint Charlie in the years to come, the ghosts of his words would haunt every man who had ever tried to tidy up the mess of history.